We continue our introduction to mathematical metaphysics by Christopher Langan. We define metaphysics as a logically idempotent metalinguistic identity of reality, which couples the two initial ingredients of awareness, perceptual reality, the basis of physics, and cognitive perceptual syntax, a formalization of mind. And today, we look deeper into Syndiffeonesis and we define the identity of reality. This leads us to a third sense in which a Syndiffeonic relation is self-dual. It relates cognition and perception, the subjective and objective aspects of reality. Where it is perceptually interpreted, its syntactic level is associated with the subject as accepting syntax or generative conatus, while its diffeonic level is associated with percepts or objects of perception. The distribution of the syntactic level of a Syndiffeonic relation generates a medium. A medium is a pointwise distribution of syntax. When a Syndiffeonic relation is understood as a distribution of syntactic syntax over diffeonic points, it functions as a logical space-time diagram. Its arity axis is spatial, while its ordinal axis is temporal. By logical geometric duality, logical binding is dual to topological bounding, and syntax functions as a metric for the medium over which it distributes, where hological means having the property that overall structure is distributed on all scales. The hological distribution of syntax throughout this medium makes it a connection among the diffeonic elements and subsets thereof. The intention connects the extension, imparting to the extension a degree of connectivity and coherence. The subjective and objective aspects of reality are the two bases of reality that we use to theorize about reality, and the Syndiffeonic relation allows to put these two domains in self-duality. It describes the link, the bridge between those two domains. It does so by identifying the subjective with the syntactic level of a Syndiffeonic relation, meaning it is the sameness level, and it's associated with the subjective because when the subject perceives content, they can read the content because there's an accepting syntax within reality that the subject has access to read what is inside the content. And so there's this accepting syntax, which is a syntactic level of a Syndiffeonic relation. There's also the generative syntax, which consists in grouping the content of reality within utile generative syntax that play the role of the conatus of the subject, meaning it is useful for the subject to create this aggregation because it reflects either the structure of reality or it generates something that is useful to understand the object of perception. So either creating new object of perception, creating new accepting syntax within reality, or just describing reality in a generative fashion to improve the self-utility that all subjects are maximizing. And the diffeonic level is associated with the percepts that feed into the subjects and all the object of perception. The object of perception can be something that is perceived by different subjects that all use their own internal subjective syntax to perceive the object. So the object is put in a self-dual relation with the subjective syntactic level. Self-duality means that the accepting syntax of the generated syntax are coupled with the percepts or object of perception, but also that the percepts or object of perception are coupled with subjects that perceive these percepts and that model these objects of perception. The subjective modeling laws are not just within a Platonic realm, and the diffeonic percepts or object of perception are not in an independent materialistic world on which the subjective emerge. Both of these domains, the subjective and objective aspects, are within a self-dual Syndiffeonic relation, meaning there's a closed link, there's a self-duality, and so you can have a monism where both of these aspects emerge from the same source. So the distribution of the syntactic subjective level of the Syndiffeonic relation generates a medium that the universe can use to define the objective aspect of reality. So the diffeonic objects of perception do not have to inhabit a Minkowski space or an external medium on which they could have sort of a structure, and then the subject observe that fixed structure that is given to the subject as an object of perception. Rather, the object of perception can be defined within that Syndiffeonic relation itself, meaning that the syntactic level of the Syndiffeonic relation generates a medium. And so you can understand it as a pointwise distribution of syntax. So the syntax, the syntactic level of the Syndiffeonic relation, distributes over points, which are just a way to distribute syntax within a self-dual relation. And so the Syndiffeonic relation itself can be the source of the medium, because the syntactic syntax defines the points that respond to that syntactic syntax. There is a whole space-time where synesis defines a fixed space, and diffeonesis defines the evolution, the temporal evolution within a space-time diagram, which is just made of a Syndiffeonic relation, which means a coupling of subjective and objective. Let's take an example. When we define the real numbers on the number line, we do not think of an external medium, of an Euclidean space, of a Minkowski space, of whatever space. We don't think of any of those space on which we define the number line. Rather, the number line is defined by the axioms of real numbers that distribute onto that number line. The axioms of real numbers, or any model that is used by the generator of the number line syntax, is what the content of this number line is. If the number line is understood as a space of approximate representation of a selection of points on a ruler, then that is what the number line is. That is the medium on which the number line is defined. If instead somebody generates a number line from the axiom of the real numbers, then any point becomes an element that satisfies the axioms of the real numbers, and they are defined compared to the constants of these axioms of the real numbers. The origin 0, the unit 1, and all of the syntactic rules that allows to define new elements within this system of axiom. So you can add the unit, you can divide the unit, and so on. By logical geometric duality, defining a space within that line, defining the numbers greater than the unit 1, is the same as logically binding the numbers to a logical formula, x greater than 1. So in a Syndiffeonic relation, the medium is a very general medium that can be a pointwise distribution of any syntax that plays the role of the subjective aspect of reality that distributes towards the objective aspect of reality. The syntax becomes as a metric that measures how points are related to each other within that space. In the number line, the property being greater than 1 is a specific syntax with a specific logical expression and a specific topological location. It does not distribute over the overall structure of the number line. But some properties, such as the axioms of real numbers, the axioms of the number line itself, that distributes over the overall medium and any subset. Even the property being greater than 1 inherits of the structure of the definition of the number line. So all the diffeonic elements within the real number system are defined by the axioms of the real number and the structure of the number line itself. So these properties are hological from the point of view of the system of the real numbers. The specific intension, the axioms of the real numbers, connect all the different points that could be specific properties of the real numbers, specific real numbers. And so all of these diffeonic instances of real numbers inherit of a degree of connectivity and coherence by the distribution of the axioms of the real numbers, by the axioms of the number line that distribute over all of them. But the real numbers are just a specific syntactic subset of reality overall. The connectivity and coherence of reality as a whole inherits from a broader hological syntax, which is the globally distributed syntax, the overall structure of reality distributed on all scales, on all of the diffeonic ingredients found within reality. Syndiffeonesis is involved in the connectivity and coherence of reality by dualizing the syntactic level of the subjective with the diffeonic level of the percepts or object of perception, so the objective. Where connectivity is the hological distribution of syntax, Syndiffeonic relation distributes the syntax over the diffeonic level. It ensures that these two aspects are able to be dualized, and so the diffeonic aspect of reality, all the different elements and subsets of reality, are tied together within syndiffeonic relations with hological unities, meaning syntax that distribute over these diffeonic elements. To sum it up, whenever in the course of perception and/or cognition, one simultaneously recognizes any number of things as different from each other, discernible, one is necessarily bringing to bear a cognitive perceptual syntax in order to accept both of them as cognitive or perceptual input, which amounts to distributing over them a common property. This common distribution belies any assumption that they are utterly different and therefore subject to dualism. Instead, they are syndiffeonically related, differing only against a homogeneous background of common syntax or cognitive sameness. So not only when you think of things in the same domain as similar, you conceive of a connected reality, but also when you perceive things as different, discernible, you also involve sameness because you perceive them as different within syndiffeonic relationships, which connect both the syntactic level, which give you the shared medium that allows you to see the diffeonic elements that you perceive as different within reality. This syndiffeonic relations distributes sameness and testify of this homogeneous background, this common syntax that has to be hologically distributed within reality. Reality has this coherence, this connectivity, because of this syndiffeonic relation that distributes the syntactic level over all the diffeonic aspects. Dualism is superseded by this joint medium. Because syndiffeonesis relates cognition and perception, our only means of knowing reality, it comprises the universal relational structure of the identity of reality, characterizing sameness and difference, generality and specificity, intention and extension, invariance and variation, set theoretic aggregation and discernment, and so on. In effect, it brings the apparatus of apprehension and attribution into every relationship that is thought or perceived, permitting it to model an attributive coupling in a self-contained fashion. To the extent that we know reality through cognition and perception, and so reality consists of cognition and perception, Syndiffeonesis, which relates cognition and perception, which dualize these two aspects, it embraces the entire structure that we can understand about reality because it encompasses the relation between cognition and perception, which are the two domains by which we can identify reality. So Syndiffeonesis becomes this universal relational structure for the theorist of reality. It presents sameness and difference, generality and specificity, intention and extension, invariance and variation, set theoretic aggregation and discernment. So all of these unity applied to a set of instances that respond to that unity as syntactic syntax distributing over diffeonic objects, as a coupling of a syntactic level with diffeonic instances. By recognizing that all of these stratas of reality are in a syndiffeonic relation, we can identify the common syntax, the syntactic level that distributes over them, and so we can understand all of these different areas of reality as apprehension, perception of content of an accepting syntax, and attribution of syntax within the diffeonic element. So there's this common syntax that distributes over them, so we attribute this common syntax. It could be generatively attributing it, but it's always an attribution of a specific syntax, a distribution of syntax over content. And the coupling is that there are content that receive this distribution of syntax. There's this object of perception that can be subjectively perceived within different models carried by different subjects that attribute different syntax to that object of perception. But essentially, all of these relationships that tie the theory to the content of the theory, the general rule to the specific instance that implements the rule, the invariance that allows to detect variation within the invariant embedding, and cognition and perception in general become embedded in this Syndiffeonic structure that reflects the attributive process of the syntactic syntax within the diffeonic instances. Attribution becomes a coupling between the syntactic and the diffeonic. It can become a self-contained coupling because you can topologically contain the diffeonic elements within the syntactic level, and you can descriptively contain the syntactic level within the diffeonic instances. By this dual sense of containment, topological containment and descriptive containment, you can define the identity of reality within a self-contained Syndiffeonic relation. So our key to reality, cognition, and perception, our access key to reality, cognition, and perception have this structure that connects all the different components, general, specific, intension, extension, and so on, within a common structure, the Syndiffeonic relationship. Science as the identification of reality. The objective of science is the identification of reality, i.e., to express the identity of reality as clearly and succinctly as possible. The identity of reality means that as which reality can be coherently identified or apprehended and locally discerned from non-reality. It identifies reality as a discernible, cohesive entity. Identity is tied to a perception, to the recognition that a perception or cognitive concept reflects reality as something opposed to non-reality, so reflects something specific. And usually when we talk about identity, we might have a partial definition of identity. The identity of a person is the ID card that allows the person to be identified with the name, the date of birth, the picture. But here, when we say that the objective of science is the identification of reality, it's not just giving a pointer to the broader identity of reality, but it's understanding the cohesive structure that ties together reality as opposed to non-reality. So science, by identifying the laws, by identifying the states within reality, identifies reality in a specific manner. And the objective of science is this full identification of the nature of reality. If we know what reality must be like, then we can predict what happens within reality. If we know that gravity is part of the identification of reality, then we know that the apple will fall on the ground when we let go of it in the air. So identity is not the ID card of reality. It's really all the inner core of what cohesively ties together reality, and that makes possible the identification of reality, that makes possible as well the prediction of structures of events or meta-events. How can we discern this cohesive entity that is reality? How can we discern real numbers as opposed to other numbers or other categories of thoughts? What is the cohesive entity that identifies as the real numbers? When we locally discern a real number, when we apprehend a number in our head, what is the identity of real numbers that allows us to say, these are real numbers? It is not because there is a tag, this is a real number, but it is because there is a structure that is assumed to be satisfied by the object apprehended, and therefore we identify it as a real number. So we can understand real numbers as opposed to non-real numbers, maybe complex numbers, maybe totally different categories of thoughts, colors, qualia. How can we identify reality when all our perceptions are within reality? It means that we're identifying a structure valid within all of our perceptions, a structure that coherently identifies everything that we perceive and that allows to discern that from non-reality, which would be everything that wouldn't fit in what can occur, what can be perceived within reality. So I think there is both a local definition of non-reality as what is not the case, but that there's also non-reality in the sense that everything that will break the invariant syntax of reality that it can have because of a need to emerge, to maintain itself, and so on. So to define this very super tautological structure, essentially. If you want to have a stable identification of reality, then you need to maintain a stable global syntax. And then when you have the global syntax, you need a structure that allows that. And anything that would break that structure would disappear in chaos because it would not maintain this stable definition of identity of reality or coherent object of science that you are aiming to identify. And so the very notion of the identity of reality, the hypothesis that reality can be identified as we do when we perceive or conceive within reality, is a mark of a structure. And so everything that breaks that, what is called a supertautological structure, would become part of non-reality. So the identity of reality becomes an identity within a potential that transcends reality that is perceived or apprehended. And so there's non-reality that is not cohesive with reality. In a similar way, when we identify real numbers, then there's a cohesive structure that distributes over all the real numbers. It's a Syndiffeonesis, so there's like a syntactic medium that allows to define every real number within this synesis. And only through that may we have this definition. Otherwise, there's no separation between real numbers and non-real numbers. And even though from the point of view of the system of real numbers itself, the structure of real numbers is sort of an absolute that grounds the definition of the real numbers themselves, so they would not be defined without that. Same way as the reality cannot be identified without having a structure of reality, there is a structure of real numbers that is specific that we can understand. It's a complete ordered field. It has specific properties. And we can say that everything that is not in accord with that structure that is distributed everywhere within the system of real numbers is part of non-reality from the point of view of that system. So there's a structure that is satisfied everywhere. And so the objective of science in the case of real numbers would be to understand the structure of these real numbers. And once it is clearly identified, then you have a proper identification of real numbers. And you can identify it as opposed to non-real numbers. And even within the system of the real numbers itself, from the point of view of the real numbers, you can still have the knowledge of the overall structures, even if it's the reality that is always the case in real numbers. It's a tautology from the point of view of the real numbers. You can still have an understanding of that structure and a conception of what would be non-reality. So even though it's everywhere distributed in the real numbers, you could imagine that the real numbers would self-perceive their structure and then have a definition of non-reality. The structure that is not the case, non-reality, which is none the axioms of real numbers, none of all the rules that are distributed everywhere within the system. An identity is a coherent, stratified, self-dual, Syndiffeonic relationship. Stratified means that the synetic level distributes over the diffeonic level as a common property, while self-dual means that both levels coincide in a single coherent entity, the Syndiffeonic relationship itself, where the synetic level is regarded as intentional and the diffeonic level as extensional. The identity is just an attributive coupling of intension and extension, i.e. of a label, attribute, or description with the set or other structure which it describes. An identity or intension-extension coupling is self-dual in the sense that the coupling distributes over both coupled entities. On this level of meaning, the coupling relation is symmetric regardless of any asymmetry on other levels. So when we talk about real numbers, we are talking about an identity of the real numbers. And so it's a coherent, stratified, self-dual, Syndiffeonic relationship, meaning there's a coherence to it, a coherence between the description and the object corresponding to the description. It is stratified because there is a synetic level, the axioms of the real numbers that distribute over every diffeonic levels, meaning the elements and perhaps all the derived objects or statements that inherit the structure of the axioms of real numbers as a basis. So there's a stratification. The synetic level distributes over all of these elements, all of these numbers particularly. And then it is self-dual because both aspects, both the description and the elements that satisfy the description are coupled within a relationship. And basically, we cannot say that the numbers belong in the axioms of the real numbers or belong in the extension in the real number line. We have to say that the identity of numbers correspond to a coupling of the axioms of the real numbers and the number line. There's both the extensional aspect, the extension of the number line with all the points within it, and the syntactic level, which is the intentional aspect, which is really all the axioms, all the structures that the numbers satisfy on the number line. And so only by coupling the axioms of the numbers and the number line do we have the identity of the number, which is a self-dual Syndiffeonic relationship. And the axioms distribute over every point within the line. So there is a stratification. The axioms are, in one sense, more diffuse than any particular number that occurs within the number line. But on the level of the coupling, we could say that both the intension, the axioms, and the extension, all the points on the number line, are self-dual, meaning you could think of the axioms of the numbers belonging within the points, and you could think of the points belonging within the axiom of the variable numbers. So there's a coupling, a symmetric relationship, even though we can clearly identify asymmetry in terms of scope, in terms of distribution, in terms of generality, in terms of the syntactic level versus the diffeonic level, in terms of one level being purely syntactic, structural, defining syntax and evolution of syntax, and the other level being geometric, specific. There's asymmetry, but on the level of the identity of numbers, we would understand them as a coupling of intension and extension. And so you have the label, attribute, or description of the set with the set. And so the description could be all the axioms. The label could be the letter R for the real numbers. And then you have the structure, the actual set that is described by these axioms of real numbers, or the actual points within the line that correspond to this label R. And this is the sort of coupling that we are talking about when we're talking about the identification of reality. And Langan is at the level of metaphysics. And so when we speak about the identity of reality, by the same token, we would have the syntactic rules, the supertautology of reality, that is like the global syntax that define what is within reality versus what is not within reality, so reality versus non-reality. So the overall syntax that is distributed in every point of reality, every point which becomes a syntactor, a very generic entity that can communicate with others, that can transform, that can recognize. So an acceptor, a transductive syntactor as well that transforms the manifold. So every point is also coupled with the intention, which becomes this supertautology as well as the content it generates and contains in the process of evolution. So you have this intention and always this extension, which carries reality, and you can think of reality as all the different points that carry the reality, but you can think as well of the intention that generates all of those points that carry the syntax, the structure that is satisfied by all these different syntactors, which are the points of the conspansive manifold. And so when we speak about science, the identity of reality, again, we're talking about this coherent, stratified, and self-dual Syndiffeonic relationship. Algebraically, an identity represents an entire algebraic system of which it may or may not be a distinguished element. In either case, it is trialic in the sense that the system it represents contains elements, relations, and operations, which means that the identity plays all three of these roles. Mathematically, this can be expressed as follows. We have our first equation, E1, I equals I in relation to I, equals an operation of I with I, where I is an identity, R is a generic relation, and star is a generic operation. This means that where I is the identity of a system S, which it therefore represents, any relation or operations under which S is closed instantiates the generic identity relation I in relation to I, and or the generic identity operation, an operation of I with I star I, and can therefore replace it under substitution, denoted with an arrow. Thus, where A and B are two related elements of S, and R prime and star prime are a specific relation and a specific operation on S, we have the following substitutions. The relation of I with I under the generic relation R is substituted with the relation of A and B under the specific relation R prime, the operation of I with I under the generic operation star is substituted with an operation of A and B under the specific operation star prime. And then we'd have also the substitution of the system to the operation of A and B under the specific operation star prime. These simple examples illustrate the Syndiffeonic aspect of identity. The identity itself, along with its generic R and star for the generic relation R and generic operation star, reside on the syntactic level, while its possible specifications are substituted to A or B on another instance of the identity, or the generic relation R substituted for the specific relation R prime, and the generic operation star substituted to the specific operation star prime, reside on the diffeonic level. So mathematically, numbers are not points on the line. They're the points, they're the relation of the point to 0, they're positive or negative, they are the operation of the unit to the point, they are the number 3, 1 plus 1 plus 1. So all of these aspects play a role in the identification of a single element within the number system. So the system itself is trialic. It is not just objects, it is relation of objects, it is operations applied on objects. With these elements, you can define a system that allows to talk about itself, to define relations. This point is at the right, this point is greater than these other points, 2 is greater than 1, 3 is greater than 2, right? The structure of the system relies on relations and operations that relate the different elements of the system. And so every time we have a point, we relate it to the unit in our system of the real numbers, because the point by itself could express the order relationship. But if you want to talk about a number, then the point needs to express a relation with the unit, which is not just a relation of order, it's a relation of specific operations that are valid between the points and the unit. And so the system of numbers are both elements and relations operations. So the structure of relations and operations define the numbers, define every single point. So that's why in the number system, you have to have entities which are both repositories of relation operation rules and elements. And this is why we have primary numbers 0, 1, and also plus infinity in our case. But these are the sort of structures that you need to have where the identity of your system cannot be a static thing, but it has to contain the capacity for relations and operations. And so the identity itself of the system could be within the algebraic system itself. So it could be an identity within the system. And even if it's an identity within the system, it's still part of the system of relations and operations that are included within the system and that allows to create networks of relations within the instances of this identity, or create a system of operations that relate the different ingredients within reality. And so for the theory of reality, identity itself is not just a label I, it's not just an identity, an element, but it is a system of relations, a system of operations within reality. And so you have the trialic aspect of the overall reality that is inherited within the system that also applies for the identity of reality as a whole. So identity is not only objects, but in a CTMU language, it is both object and space-time object, where space is a relation between objects. It's the generalization of space in the level of syntax, of static relation within syntax, and time becomes the generalization of evolution with the operations within the language system, with the grammar that transforms the system. And so you have here the space-time object triality that is expressed here algebraically, with this existence of an identity that is tied to relations and operations. And it is tied to that both at a syntactic level and a diffeonic level, where diffeonic level doesn't mean just different instances, so different identity, and then all relations and all operations are within the syntactic, let's say. No, the relations and operations also have a diffeonic level, which is the specific operation, the specific relation. But the generic property of the system of being trialic with both elements, relations, and operations, this becomes a syntactic level of the metastructures of the language that supports the identity. So the system S can instantiate relations, instantiate operations, and each time it does that, it is just a diffeonic aspect of the general property of the system to be trialic with this equation 1. So that's why this equation 1 is fundamental, because it defines the identity of a linguistic system with elements that create networks of relations and that operate between themselves. So you have an evolution, a state, a description with relational rules of how to create networks of elements within themselves. And you have the element themselves that respond and that can be substituted within relations and operations, and that create this trialic aspect of the system that can be a specific state, that can be known through relations, that can evolve through operations from the element of the system, that are the elements that are related by the relations and that operate within reality. And by triality, the relations and the operations can be contained within the element, creating triality within a self-contained system. These general synthetic capacity of reality can be specified to specific identities, which allows the identity to reflect relations between these elements that the identity represents. In the case of numbers, when you apply operations, you still remain within the identity of real numbers. When you look at relations, when you look at B is greater than A, you are not within the typical identity of real numbers, because now you're more in the domain of relations of Boolean. It is either true or false that it is the case that B is greater than A. But within the system of the language itself, this truth, this B being greater than A, can still be an identity of reality. It remains a perception. So at the level of reality, you don't have these boundaries. Even the relations between different sub-identities within reality remain an identity within reality. You perceive different sub-identities, you put them in relations, and this relation between these different sub-identities remains an identity that you perceive within reality. It remains within the identification of reality. It keeps the structure of the supertautology of the theory of reality. And so for the identity of reality itself, this trialic aspect and this syndiffeonic aspect of having the generic triality being translatable into specific relations and operations becomes something much more broad, where even the identity of reality overall has this preservation within relations and operations. And so you can have a system where the identity of reality overall is understood as trialic in itself in a very generic way. For the overall structure of reality becomes trialic, and that's what allows you to understand within reality the identity of reality itself, because the identity of reality itself becomes an element of its own algebraic system. We must not mistake the static syntax that we're able to extract from reality through relations and through operations as something that carries the identity of the object itself. The state that is identified is not the identity of reality. Reality is both the object, the relation, and the operation. It is both object, space, and time at the linguistic syntactic level. Only through this triality can we understand the identity of reality, can we understand the identity of real numbers through the self-duality of the logical geometric self-duality, which characterizes specific intension, extension, coupling of the real numbers. And it is through the structure, the supertautological structure of the identity language, that science needs to ground itself. It needs to ground itself at the level where it conceives of science as describing the system of reality S that has both the identity, the general structure of relations and operations, and so that has this trialic aspect. And so we need to structure this trialic aspect, and we need to structure this coupling to allow science to reflect an identity within reality, the identity of reality. Note, however, that as conventionally understood, the operational and relational closure of an algebraic system does not imply that its identity is completely self-contained. Instead, the mathematician and any required display, storage, or processing media are typically missing from its formal idealization, and it is usually considered to exist in a Platonic realm beyond which no explanation is required. In a theory of everything, a TOE, this is unacceptable. So if you define a system of real numbers with both the logic that contains all the statements that you can make about relations, number being greater than the other, numbers being the image through a function by another number. Even if you define the system to contain both the set of real numbers, the set of operations that are closed within the set of real numbers, and you define the system to contain logic, it seems that it's self-contained, but it is leveraging the mathematician. It is leveraging the display or storage within a paper, within a whiteboard, within any kind of media that sustains the definition of the mathematical object, within the memory. And so the processing media and the mathematician and every other ingredients are abstracted when we think of the closure of systems. We think we're defining them, and so even if we don't have the paper here, even if we don't have the mathematician that thinks about the systems, they still exist in this Platonic realm, meaning the truth remains beyond the mathematician, beyond the display, beyond the storage, beyond the processing. Even when we add numbers, the processing of numbers, we consider that it is done within this realm of numbers. But in actuality, in the theory of reality, in the theory of everything, we cannot just outsource the containment of the system to this Platonic realm. We need to have a theory of everything that contains these Platonic realms. And so we need to be mindful of including every ingredient that is needed to make the system, the identity of reality, self-contained. So when we have a closed operational, relational, algebraic system, we need to extend the algebraic system to not require any Platonic realm. So we need to have an explanation that really stems from a source that is trialic at its core, that has these supertautological ingredients, that like a truth that is as the core, that allows to become specifically identified with the particular algebraic system that is carried by the points of this source. And so we need to have these syntactors, we need to have the structure of the syntactors that carry the identity of the system within the theory of the system, within the theory of the identity of reality, to have a full explanation. We cannot have this Platonic realm that is sort of this assumption that everything that is generated within reality, anyway, it existed prior in this Platonic realm, and it will exist even when any perception of this object will not occur within reality, because there's no mathematician, there's no media that carry the definition. No, in the theory of everything, you need to have this theory of where it all emerged and where it is all contained, and the theory of the Syndiffeonic identity of reality, because reality is relationally and operationally closed. Everything within reality is explained or created, configured by reality, because there's nothing except reality to relate these components or to operate on these components. Then reality needs to be a system that is self-contained, and so that contains all of the ingredients without any unknown Platonic realm that will contain reality. Because then if there was this Platonic realm, it will be part of reality. So it's a principle of reality of the CTMU. It would be part of the reality, and so the structure between this Platonic realm and the shadows of reality as observed by us, we need to have a specific structure that is part of the theory of reality that covers both all of the perceptions and all the cognitive apparatus that explains those perceptions. And so the Platonic realm is part of reality, part of the theory of everything, and so needs to be also part of this algebraic system. And because there's nothing but reality to define the relation, the structure of this Platonic realm, how there would be operations within this Platonic realm, we also need to include the whole of reality without assumptions that there is a mathematician or there is a greater meta-reality that allows to contain this partial understanding of reality that we would be defining. So the triality of the system as a whole has to be defined at the very highest level. There is no Platonic realm that sort of would escape this equation 1, where you would have reality as a whole. That is both the element of the system, this element that is trialic as a whole, through this generic relation and generic operation within reality. So generic self-description and self-operation, self-execution, self-evolution. We have to formalize the container of reality. And so since the container can only be contained by itself, there's a dual sense of containment, the descriptive containment and the topological containment. Need to emerge through a self-duality, through a Syndiffeonic relationship. The identity of reality becomes this stratified Syndiffeonic relationship within this trialic self-contained system. In such a system, the definition of numbers has to belong, because it needs to emerge within a self-contained system. So it needs to emerge as an intension extension coupling within a broader intension extension coupling, the overall identity of reality that specifies into the identity of numbers.